Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to our first ever Spotlight webinar. We are really excited to be doing this tonight. It's been something that Jade and I have been picking up for a number of months, and we really hope you all enjoy it, take something from it, and above all, that it's helpful and useful. I'm sure most of you know who we already are, but in case you don't, by way of introductions, my name's Bradley. I'm a psychologist at InnerDrive. I'm the co-author of the book Science of Learning. And yeah, the areas around that I've always found most interesting on research are probably about memory and learning. And so really looking forward to telling you some of my favorite studies that we've been reading recently. So yeah, that's me.
And hello everybody, my name's Jade Pearce. I'm an assistant head teacher in charge of teaching and learning in CPD at the moment at a high school in Staffordshire. This is my 14th year as a teacher, and I'm also author of What Every Teacher Needs to Know, which came out recently. And I wanted to take this opportunity really to talk about why we have come up with the Teaching and Learning Spotlight. So if you follow me on Twitter or you've read anything that I've ever written, you'll know how passionate I am about evidence-informed teaching and learning, and that's obviously clear from the title of my book as well. I am super passionate that we've got these best bets from research, these things that we know are likely to make the biggest difference to pupils' learning and therefore their outcomes, and that we all need to know about these things, and we need to look at the research into how to implement them most effectively in our teaching. But at the same time, I work full time and I've got 2 kids and I'm super busy, and I am very aware about how time poor teachers and school leaders are. And so really the purpose of the Teaching and Learning Spotlight is to try and make all the research, the most recent research, accessible to teachers and school leaders, so that you're not having to read every single paper for yourself. I get messages all the time on Twitter about how do you find papers, how do you access papers, how do you find the time to do that. And so we're really hoping, I think, Brad, aren't we, that the Teaching and Learning Spotlight will take that away, and it gives a really easy way for teachers to stay up to date with the latest research, get some practical takeaways without having to slog through the references for papers and read 9 papers which maybe aren't relevant to find one that is, because we're going to do that for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think it's just so frustrating that lots of research is behind paywalls. It's hard to find. Sometimes they're written in really psych-heavy jargon, I think. And that's really what we wanted, is to spotlight some of what we think are the most interesting studies, but also just make them accessible and attainable for the people who need them the most, i.e. teachers. The other thing I think I'd just add before we start going through the studies is, and I'm sure, Jade, hopefully you agree with me, is I firmly believe that one research paper doesn't contain all the answers. Like, there can never be a definitive truth, but I think the more studies you know, the easier it is to piece when a new study comes along, kind of where it fits or how much weight to put on it. So although none of the studies that we cover today, I don't want to hold them up as being 100% fact and this is the only thing people should do. I think each new study adds a bit more information, adds a bit more context, and allows us to paint a clearer overall picture. And it's just easier to come up with guidelines or best bets, as Jade kind of said.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and I think that's massively important. We're all probably aware. You know, you've signed up to this. Everyone on the call will probably have some knowledge of evidence-informed teaching and learning, of cognitive science, etc. So we know we've got these big strategies that we think are going to be most effective. For me, when I've read the studies, what I've really liked is they improve my understanding of the strategies a little bit more. So it's not going to be a huge thing, but it's, oh, actually, if I tweak this part of my practice, it will be a little bit more effective. And I think that's really useful.
100%. So let's get cracking. We have just over an hour and we have 10 different studies. So let's start with the first one. Over to you, Jade.
Thank you. So this study re-examined the 2013 paper by Dunlosky, where he looked at improving students' learning with effective learning techniques. And lots of us will have read that paper. or will have read the shorter version, which was strengthening the student toolbox. And basically, in that original paper, Dunlosky had identified from the strategies that are on the screen, those which are most effective and those which he called least effective. And this study by by Donoghue and Hattie basically re-examined that. So I really like that, because I thought, right, we've got this seminal paper, lots of people know about and lots of people talk about, and we're going to see whether or not our findings currently match that. So we're going to either add weight to it or get some nuance, etc. And essentially, what the authors found was that lots of similarities to Dunlosky. So first of all, they found that in the same way as Dunlosky, distributed practice, so space practice and practice testing were the most effective. So you can see there an effect size is 0.7 and 0.85, and basically anything over 0.8 would be considered a really large effect size, a really powerful learning strategy. So definitely highlighting those two practices as being most effective. It also, in a similar way to Dunlosky, found that there were some strategies, underlining and summarization, we can probably put rereading in there as well, which are less effective. So they aren't active, they're not using your long-term memory, so they're not going to make as big as difference to learning. However, really interestingly, this review found that there was some strategies which Dunlosky has identified as being kind of moderate. And here we might look at self-explanation, interleaving and mnemonics, which actually still have quite a big effect size. So we would say 0.5 would be a medium effect size. And you can see from that, you've got self-explanation, imagery, interleaving and mnemonics, which actually will make a big difference to pupils' learning. So that was really interesting. And I think that really, the takeaway there is to look at all of these are effective. They all have a medium to large kind of effect size, and actually we shouldn't discount any of them, and that they will all be useful in different circumstances, but that actually we know it's adding additional weight to the benefits of spacing and retrieval practice. The other really important thing was there was a difference between subjects, and I think this is really important. This is that additional nuance that I was talking about. So for example, mnemonics were found to be really effective in English. Imagery was really effective in languages, and you can imagine that, imagining and using images to look at the meaning of new words, for example. Interleaving was most effective in maths, and we know that's a really common finding. Mixing up problems in maths is really effective. And summarizing and elaborative interrogation, where we're asking pupils to explain their answers, are really effective in science. And again, I think we can imagine why that would be the case, because science is all about explaining why things happen. So in terms of takeaways, retrieval practice and spacing are the most effective. We've got those supposedly lower utility ones, which are effective really, but certainly effective in different circumstances. And just be aware that there are differences for different subjects. And I think that's a really nice reminder of not to do a kind of blanket recommendation for or against certain strategies.
I guess one question I just wanted to ask you, and your thoughts on this, Jade, was, well, I guess one observation and one question. My first observation is, this study kind of made me tweak my mind a little bit, because I used to say, highlighting and rereading were ineffective, and now I kind of look at this and go, they're just not as effective. They're not necessarily bad, they just might not be the most efficient. Yeah. But the one question I wanted to ask you was with regards to interleaving, because it's an area that I know we've both spoken about quite a bit, in terms of this study makes it seem like it's not as effective as I was expecting. Like, I know we're saying all of these are potential strategies worth considering, but the gap between interleaving and mnemonics or rereading isn't as big as I would have expected. Yeah. Any thoughts as to why or what's going on there?
Yeah, so I think there's two things. I think first of all, we probably need a lot more research into interleaving, and that was highlighted by the EF review into the research behind cognitive science. Actually, there's just not that much research done on interleaving, so we probably need to look at that. But also, I think it's like you said in your blog recently, actually, Brad, our view of interleaving and what interleaving is has changed. So I think that this might have been caused by interleaving actually being introduced less effectively than it should have been. So, for example, we now know that interleaving is caused by pupils discriminating between different concepts, and that actually, if we've done it in the past where we might have looked at one topic then another topic, or where we've advised students to revise a certain subject and then revise a certain subject, that actually isn't the most effective use of interleaving. And what we want to do is interleave really similar examples, concepts that students get confused. And I think we'd have to look at what actually was done in interleaving in these studies, and was it the kind of true definition of interleaving?
Really interesting. Definitely one for cognitive science to research a bit more, I think, moving forward. So maybe in future editions of the Spotlight, we can kind of keep going back to interleaving a few times and see maybe how it develops over the coming months. Okay, so that was study 1, which leads us on to study 2, which looks at specific questions during retrieval practice. Why I think we both find this study quite interesting is I think we're going beyond retrieval practice can help learning. I think that's kind of becoming mainstream and accepted. And I think now we're talking about the how and the application for it. Kind of what you were saying earlier, Jade, about tweaking practice. And I think this study allows for us to reflect on that and potentially tweak how we deliver it. So to explain what they did in this study and the findings, this study had 2 groups. They had a control group and an experimental group. So in the first group, students all had to learn about coffee. And so they were giving text passages to read about coffee. And so this included like the knowledge about the coffee plant, how it was harvested, how coffee is processed, and finally how coffee is produced. So they were given this kind of information, and then later on they were given kind of memory tests to see what they remembered. The second group got given the same information about the coffee plant, how it's harvested, how it's processed, and how it's produced. But in the second group, they got something a little bit different. They got given what the researchers called seductive details. And seductive details are interesting, but ultimately irrelevant information. So the seductive detail they gave in the study, and I love it, they actually listed this in the study, they told students the story about how coffee was discovered. And the way coffee was discovered is apparently goat farmers, they saw their goats eating the coffee plant, and the goats apparently literally got drunk on coffee. They had a caffeine high, and the goats basically started dancing. And so the farmers wanted to find out, if we ingest the coffee plant, do we get the same sort of effect? So that's the interesting, but ultimately irrelevant information that they slipped in to kind of compare against the original group. And then they asked the groups different types of questions. Some of the groups got this very specific question, such as, which brewing methods can you name and how do they differ? So very selective, very targeted retrieval practice going on there. The second group got a more of a generalized kind of question, which is, what can you tell me about coffee? So still a form of retrieval, but a lot more open, a lot more vague, and not very specific. And what they were really interested in that group that had the irrelevant information, so the ones that had the goats, eating, getting drunk on coffee, they found that if you asked that group the specific questions, so what can you tell me about the 2 different brewing methods and how do they differ? If you asked that sort of question, those students, they remembered significantly more of the important information. I think the researchers had it at about 39% more of the important information they were able to later recall. Whereas the group where had the irrelevant information, when they got this general question, such as, what can you tell me about coffee? This group were far more likely to remember the irrelevant information about the goats, and they were much less likely to remember the important information. And what I find interesting about this sort of study is when we've tested retrieval practice in the past in lab conditions, it's often very controlled, often done on short sets of words, for examples, whereas that doesn't often reflect what actually happens in the real world, in a classroom where there is competing information, when students do sometimes get exposed to redundant information. And so this really looks at, how do we help students improve their memory when there is lots of irrelevant competing information? And this study would suggest being quite specific with our questions, as opposed to quite general, is a vehicle to doing so. And so that for me has really made me reflect on retrieval practice. I guess the 2 main questions I take from this is, A, what's the irrelevant information that I can reduce? So get rid of the interesting goat story. That's the thing that's going to stick in their mind, maybe. And the other thing I take from it is, if there are specific bits of information I want students to remember, how often are they actually retrieving that specific information, and how do I hopefully enhance and facilitate that? So I think some nice practical implications for this study here.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Brad. It made me think about, when we do retrieval practice, how many of us have sat down and really identified what are the most important elements, knowledge, skills, etc., that we want our pupils to remember in the long term? And do we concentrate our retrieval practice on that? Or do we just do a nice activity that we found on Twitter, or a quiz because it was really easy to write? And I think probably in a lot of cases it will be the former. It certainly was in our school kind of a couple of years ago, and only really from that kind of last year we've really thought about, no, what do we want to retrieve, and then making sure that that is what we concentrate on. I also think it might have wider implications, because it basically means that, and we know this, we remember what we retrieve, and we don't remember what we don't retrieve. Now that shows us that if we only ever ask the same questions when we do our retrieval practice, but we miss some elements of a topic because we haven't planned it properly, we're encouraging our students to forget part of the information. So it's really important for me, you plan your retrieval practice so that you are covering everything, but that you cover topics in different ways from different approaches to make sure you've covered the whole topic, if that makes sense, kind of over time. Because if you don't retrieve it, you are going to forget about it.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. And I had a teacher fairly recently, I taught them through this study, and they said, so is this saying I can't tell my really interesting story at the start that I use as a hook? Because they felt it really increased students' attention and curiosity. And I don't think that is what this study is saying. It's not saying you can't tell your cool hook if you want to. It's saying if you do that, make sure you follow up with the specific questions, because it's the specific questions that can help counteract the cool story in terms of what they're going to remember. So yes, seductive details, definitely one. And I see a few people in the chat box saying the same in terms of something to be aware of. Right, let's go on to study 3, Jade. And this is something that I was dying to read when I came across this study, because I see it all the time with students in terms of how do they use the internet, and what, we always hear this, just Google it. That's why you don't need knowledge and facts. Why don't you talk us through this study here, Jade?
Thank you. So yeah, really interesting study and really interesting addition to the debate around the importance of knowledge, as in, it's not important to know things because students can just Google it. And this is a nice kind of antidote to that argument, if you've ever had that with anybody in your school. So basically this looked at, should students try to complete the task before looking it up, or should they just look it up on Google first and then answer the task? And basically half of a group were told that they could use Google straight away to help them with the task that they were going to do, and the other half had to think about it first and have a go first, and then complete the task. And the researchers found that they found that before rushing to Google, if you had a go at completing the task first of all, you performed 12% better on the multiple choice test. So if you are not experienced, you will still perform better if you think about a task first and then Google it to kind of check your answers correct, add anything in that you didn't know, maybe complete the bits that you couldn't. And that's even more so for pupils with experience, with some knowledge. And they perform 27% better if they thought about the task or the question first and then Googled it. And the study said that this was due to the deeper processing and the activation of prior knowledge, which occurs if you have to think about the task first. So really important that our learning is better and deeper, and that we remember things more, and that will perform better on future tests if we think about an answer first, and if we have a go at completing a task first on our own before we then use Google or any external source to add to that. So and that's especially true if we've got some experience, if we've got some prior knowledge. So basically what we are explaining to our teachers, but I think also to our students, really important that they know about this one as well, is that your learning will be better if you have a go on your own first and then use Google or, I don't know, your revision guide, etc., to then have a check of your answer and add to it.
So I'm guessing on this one, kind of by having a think about it first, if then what you then find on Google makes more sense.
Yeah, exactly that.
You can connect it.
Yeah, and also you've done a bit of retrieval, haven't you? Because you've had a go on your own. You've processed the task on your own, I think is important. You've activated your prior knowledge. So the new, it's all about schema building, isn't it? The new knowledge that you then get off Google can hook onto the prior knowledge that you've activated by having a go on your own first. So I think there's probably quite a lot of answers, but essentially what it comes down to is don't just have a look up. Don't just look up the answer, have a go on your own first, really think about what do you know, how it might help you, and then if you need to, go to an external source.
Right. I'm going to ask you a completely unscripted question, so proper spotlight you here. As a parent, this is the sort of thing that I think is really valuable for parents to know. How do you think, I know the research doesn't perhaps have an answer, but just from your experience, how do we go about kind of getting parents to know about this sort of stuff? And because you mentioned students and teachers, but I look at this and go, if homework is done at home, parents have got to know about this sort of stuff.
Really good point. So we actually do a parents forum in my school where we talk about how we teach at our school and why we teach in that way. And that's useful for loads of reasons. So for example, we had loads of kids who came back after the pandemic and were really anxious about answering questions in class. So the parent forum, especially an information evening with some informal chat, that allowed us to explain why we ask questions, why we use cold calling, that it's not a negative thing, and it helps to get support for some of the strategies that you want to use. And then part of the evening we always do independent study skills, so we look at the cognitive science model of memory, we look at spacing and revision, we look at lots of your papers actually from your pink book on use of mobile phones, sleep, music when you're revising. And I think this would fit really nicely in there, as in if your child comes to you and says I'm stuck, your first response is not let's have a look on Google. Your first response is, well, let's look at what you do know, think about the task on your own, and then let's have a look.
Makes perfect sense. Okay, we move on to study 4. Study 4 is one of mine, and this looks at it's called the effect on temporary mark withholding on academic performance. And what I found this study really interesting, both from my own experience when I was a student and what I see happening now with students a lot, is as soon as you get a mark back from a teacher on a piece of work or on an exam, the often go-to reaction is to ask your friends, how did they do? And, everyone gets very fixated on the grade. Either did they get higher or lower than anyone else, or was it higher or lower than what they were expecting? And it's difficult, I think, because grades might be a not bad snapshot of performance, whereas feedback often is where the learning can really take place. And I've always wondered, is it possible for me to process both at the same time? Can I really process my grade, which tells me my current level, and process the feedback on how to get better, or does one kind of dominate the other? And essentially, does knowing about my grade make me less likely to process the feedback? And that's exactly what this study looked at. This study ran 2 experiments. I'm mainly going to give the results from the second experiment. And so what they did, one of the groups got given their grades and their feedback at the same time, whereas the other group got given their feedback 3 days before their grades. So it's absolutely, I should say, it's absolutely not saying don't give grades. That wasn't what this study looked at all. So it wasn't really feedback versus grades. It was more about how it gets delivered. Do you do grades and feedback at the same time, or do you do feedback 3 days before and then give the grade? And what's cool about this study for me is they tracked students over the course of the year. So what they found in term 1, I should point out the scale here, very randomly in research, they always throw up some weird stats. Grades were basically normalized on a 23-point scale. So the higher, then the nearer to 23, the higher and the better the grade. And they found students who got their grades and feedback at the same time, if you compare, and if you kind of track them from term 1 to term 2, almost no difference. The feedback isn't really landing. And yet the second group, if you give feedback 3 days before the grades, well, in term 1, they did a bit better, not really much so, but a little bit. Whereas in term 2, we see this huge increase. And the research suggests often the benefit is magnified for lower achieving students. And they tended to view the feedback more times. This was all done electronically, so we can kind of track who logs in to view their feedback. And they found giving the feedback before you give the grades, it's theorized it might lead to more processing of the feedback. And there was a great quote from this study that really stood out for me, that the researcher said, the best feedback in the world is moot if students don't use it to accelerate and advance their performance. And I think that's exactly what we're looking at here, is so much feedback training is all about what type of feedback and how do we give feedback and how do students receive it. Whereas if we're giving really high quality feedback, but they're not processing it, it is largely redundant. The other thing I quite like about this study is this is done in like what they call, research called the real world. Like, it's not done in a controlled lab on an artificial memory test. This was real students doing real work that counted towards their course and their grades. And yeah, I think this gives some nice indication. I've heard feedback be described as a double-edged sword, and the fact that it can be one of the best accelerators for learning, but if done badly, can hinder learning. And I think this gives some indication of a vehicle for making feedback effective.
Yeah, I completely agree with this, Brad. And this actually, I read this first when I was writing my book, and it completely chimes with what I'd experienced as a teacher. So what I found is, as soon as you put a grade on something, like as soon as you say that is 18 out of 20, the kids who have done really well go, oh, amazing, 18 out of 20. I don't need to do anything because I've done really well. And the kids that have done really badly go, oh my God, 4 out of 20. I'm awful at the subject. And they don't want to read your feedback because they just want that out of the way. Where actually, if you give your formative feedback, but most importantly, actually, it's not just giving the feedback before the grades, it's giving the feedback and getting the pupils to do something with it. So I would give like my whole class verbal feedback at the start of my lesson. We'd look at good examples, we'd improve our work. And then at the end of the lesson, you might give your feedback your grades, because the feedback has already been used. So definitely delay, because they're more receptive to the feedback, get them to do something. And then if you want to give a grade at the end, I think is really good practice here.
Nice. This study, I should have said, it actually reminds me of a great story. One of my friends who works in kind of internet, and when you click accept cookies on any website, it kind of tracks, basically when you accept cookies, it tracks how long you're on any given web page for. And he said, if you notice film reviews, if you read about film reviews online, they found that if you give the star rating at the top of the article, apparently the time that people spend reading the review, which is basically the feedback, is minimal, because people go, that got 5-star, I'll go see it, or that got 2-star, it's not even worth me reading the review. Whereas they've often changed it now they give the star rating at the end of the page, because it basically prompts people to engage with the feedback first, and they found that makes people stay on the website a lot longer. And I think this is kind of the equivalent, is,
yes, I agree.
If the feedback is what's going to help them, and that's what we value, how do we make sure that we highlight that to them and signal to them the feedback matters? And this study did that by giving it in advance. So I think that's a nice way of seeing it.
Yeah, brill. And we've had someone in the chat, I can't see the name, sorry, because it won't move up, saying that they use self feedback, and I think that's fine as well. The pupils working on their own feedback and doing their own targets based on maybe what you've gone through as a class. I think that would really work here as well. So a nice example.
Lovely, which means we are at the halfway stage. And study 5 is one of yours, Jade.
Yes, this is another one that looked at retrieval practice. So another one which is trying to improve our kind of nuance and the depth of understanding about retrieval practice. And it was looking at the impact on performance, on learning, but it also looked at the impact on metacognition, on how well we could judge our own learning. So first of all, what we basically had is two studies, but in the first study, which I'll talk about now, 2 groups. Group 1 were given the opportunity to do a practice test every 3 weeks before taking a final exam. So they had practice test, and then set a final exam. Group 2 didn't receive any practice tests between their final exam, so they just did their studying and then did the final exam. And the results showed that students who took the practice test did better than those who didn't. So another study which has found the testing effect to be alive and well, and that we know that if we do these practice tests, we're going to learn more for longer and we're going to do better in our final test. But also, and really importantly here, not only did pupils' learning improve, but their ability to judge whether or not they got an answer right was improved. So not their ability to judge if they got something wrong, they still weren't better at doing that, but they were more confident essentially that they knew they got the right answer when it was right. So in this case, practice tests did help students to think, I've written that answer and I am confident that is right. So they were better at identifying what they did know, essentially. We then had a second study, similar. Group 1 were given the option to take practice tests and get feedback. Okay, so they did their practice tests, but they also got feedback before taking their final exam, where Group 2 just set the practice test with no feedback. And here we found that the group that got feedback on their practice tests learnt more overall, were better able to identify the correct answers, but most importantly, were better able to identify incorrect answers. So that's really important. Essentially, what this is showing us is that we want to provide practice tests because we know that retrieval practice is really effective for learning. But if we provide feedback on those tests, so whether answers are correct or not, you could do that electronically, or you could do that by going through those practice tests as a class, that pupils will more able to identify if their answers are correct, but really importantly, no, I know that that answer is wrong, and then I can change that, I can do something about that in the future. And that's it for this one.
Lovely. And I think what was, I guess, quite interesting about this sort of study, and I'd encourage everyone to read it if they can, is it ties in lots of popular areas at the moment, I think, within education. So you've got retrieval practice, you've got feedback, and metacognition. And I think metacognition is one that often people find it's so broad and it covers so many areas. Sometimes it can feel quite hard to pin down like, how do we actually help develop metacognitive students? And feedback after retrieval is one of those ways. It helps people become more aware of what they know and what they don't know, essentially.
Yeah, completely agree. And there's really practical ways that you can implement this in your teaching as well. So you can do retrieval practice, just make sure that the pupils get feedback. So that might be online quizzing tools, because there's loads of those that will give you immediate feedback, or it might be that you do a whole class discussion and you go through the answers. So really easy to implement. I think what's less easy to implement is making sure that pupils then address those areas of weakness. So I know this answer is incorrect, or that I didn't know this. What do I do about it? And using things like independent study logs or setting additional retrieval practice tasks for each pupils can be really beneficial there as well.
Lovely. So study 6, which has a pretty impressive title, at its core, really wanted to review and look at what does the research say about the difference between spacing and interleaving. And this is something Jade kind of nodded to earlier. So they did a large-scale review of the research, and they basically came up with 2 main findings. The first was they looked at spacing, and they found one of the main reasons why spacing is effective. So spacing being regularly revisiting the same material. And they found the reason why spacing was quite effective is essentially it helps avoid cognitive overload. So essentially, if you think of learning essentially like an iPhone battery, learning is hard. So essentially it drains the battery. And then after the battery's been drained, it needs to recharge, which is why we charge our phone essentially overnight. And that's what the spacing allows. It allows gaps in between the learning for us to mentally recharge. Essentially, because our working memory is so limited and so fragile, it needs time to recover and regenerate. And that's what spacing allows us to do. Essentially, because learning is meant to be difficult, you know, we've all heard the phrase, you know, memory being the residue of thought. Because it's difficult, we do need times to recharge in between it, or else it would simply be too overwhelming. And that they found is the main benefit of spacing, essentially leaving gaps to allow us to recharge. And ideally, this study suggests, you know, the longer the gap, the more likely you are to retain that information for a long period of time. It also looked at interleaving. So spacing is regularly revisiting material. Interleaving, the main benefit of interleaving is known as discrimination learning. So discrimination learning, if I was to oversimplify it, but get it at its generalness, is comparing and contrasting. You know, how are A and B similar? How are they different? And in doing so, it allows people to become more aware of the differences between them. And this is really important, especially on subjects that students get confused between. It can help highlight what's similar and what is different about them. And when I read this study, this was actually a bit of an aha moment for me, if you like, because if you take those two blue boxes, what it actually suggests is spacing. In order to avoid cognitive overload, we need nice big gaps, not so big that you've completely forgotten it, but big enough that you're starting to forget it, and then you relearn it, because that big gap allows you to recharge. Whereas interleaving, because it's mainly based on this discrimination learning, which is comparing, contrasting the difference, actually in terms of proximity, you want the two things to be really close to each other. Like it's really easy, it's easier to compare and contrast when you don't have to remember the thing from 3 weeks ago. When you saw it, 5 minutes ago, you're able to compare and contrast A versus B. And so for me, this kind of, I now kind of see proximity as the key difference often between these two things. Well, one of the differences is proximity, spacing you do it far away, interleaving you do it near each other. The other main difference, I think, is spacing is the same material revisited, whereas interleaving is different, but similar.
Yeah, completely agree with that. And I think when I read this study, again, for me, it was also that's how interleaving should be used. It's not mixing up, doing a bit of geography, then doing a bit of science. That's not interleaving. Interleaving is thinking, right, there's these concepts in science that we all confuse. Let's look at them next to each other and talk about the similarities and differences and ask people to identify the similarities and differences in order to help remember that linked content. So I think it's one of those things, it's that how can we implement things most effectively? Well, interleaving is going to be most effective if we use similar contexts. I think it's added to our knowledge of interleaving, which is great.
Yeah, so I guess interleaving is, as you say, it's concepts as opposed to subjects.
Yes, definitely.
Which then kind of begs the question, is it even possible to interleave a curriculum? Because I think you can space a curriculum essentially, but that interleaving, if it has to be about close proximity and not subjects, about concepts, arguably you can't.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what people call an interleave curriculum, like in English, where you look at poetry one day and then Shakespeare another day and then something else, that actually isn't an interleave curriculum. It's a space curriculum because you're doing poetry, then after a gap you're doing poetry. Interleaving would be two poems that pupils confuse. You look at them next to each other. So I think, again, yeah, it's cleared up quite a lot, I think, of misconceptions around that practice, which is great.
Yeah. So let's go on to study 7.
So study 7, do students learn what they teach when generating teaching materials? So we've all kind of heard the old adage of, if you want to learn something, teach it to somebody else. And this paper kind of examined that. It examined how effective is it when pupils prepare to teach other pupils. So if we make our own resources and then share them with others or prepare to teach others, will that be effective for our learning? Essentially what it found was that yes, we can learn if we are preparing to teach somebody else using the materials, but interestingly it found that what we want is auditory visual materials, so a presentation, for example, like this, or where you're preparing a script with explanations rather than written materials, which actually is brilliant. I've done this really badly in the past, where I've said, oh, can we we're all going to teach each other, so let's pick a concept each and we're going to teach each other. And then what the kids do is they write down their notes and then they sit and they read out their notes to the other person, or even worse, they just switch, so you're just reading each other's notes. And that obviously is not what this is saying at all. And what it's saying is it's much better if instead of doing that, we prepare a presentation that we've got to expand on, that we've got to explain. And you can see well, that's much more depth of processing, isn't it, that you're having to put in. Much more thought goes into preparing a presentation like this than maybe just copying down notes from a textbook that you're then going to read out. So that if we are going to ask our pupils to teach someone else, that it should be auditory visual materials more than text-based materials. And interestingly, this only looked at secondary pupils, and it found that older secondary pupils benefited more from this technique than younger secondary pupils. So probably not something to try at primary school, not something to try maybe with our younger pupils. An okay technique with our older pupils if we ask them to prepare those auditory visual materials. Also, I'm going to point out one last point, and that's that the study itself actually says we need to make sure that the time taken doesn't outweigh the benefits. It's not a technique that's more effective than other techniques like explicit instruction. So if you're going to use this technique, maybe use it for homework, because then you're not taking up your curriculum time with something which actually doesn't has like a huge impact on learning.
Why do you think, any thoughts, or do you remember what the researcher said, why it's more effective for older students than younger students?
I think it's probably because the skills in making the kind of auditory visual materials are there for older pupils. And it's also maybe because younger pupils would get overloaded. They'd think about, I'm making a presentation, not about the actual content. You know, memory is the residue of thought. So if you're thinking about the design of your presentation, you're not maybe thinking as much about the content itself. So maybe a couple of reasons there.
Yeah, I was wondering if it might be, you know, the depth of explanation gets richer and more complex as you get older, and therefore, interesting. Study number 8 was titled, Can Guidance During Play Enhance Children's Learning and Development in Educational Context? So this was a systematic review and meta-analysis. So whereas some of the other studies we've touched on have been, you know, comparing A to B, or like a control trial, what this study did was a collection of various studies that looked at this sort of area. And why I think this is quite interesting is, you know, there's this age-old debate in education, I don't see it ending anytime soon, is, you know, should teachers be a guide on the side, or should you be kind of the sage on the stage? You know, how much do you let people just discover the answer for themselves versus how much do you explicitly detail what you want them to do and why that's the case? And guidance during play, I would imagine, kind of sits somewhere between the two. Essentially. So they're trying to see is, can you get the best of both worlds? And if I'm honest, it wasn't a term that I was overly familiar with. And the researcher said guidance during play, you know, there has to be 3 criteria. One is there has to be a clear learning goal. So it's not play for play's sake. Students have to have some ownership and should be child-led. So, you know, that's kind of, I guess, the play elements kind of coming through there. But the adult who is supervising, who is teaching them, has to use a range of techniques to kind of guide them during this play. So this was done in primary school children aged, and what they found was that guidance during play did have a positive effect. They found it had a greater positive effect over instruction on early math skills and shape knowledge. And they said that there are kind of 3 or 4 main reasons potentially for this. One, guided play seemed to have a really positive impact on the emotional side of learning, such as motivation and enjoyment and positive attitude towards the task. They found it's probably better than just complete free play in terms of improving expressive and receptive language. And I would imagine that, especially with the young children, if they haven't yet developed expressive language yet themselves, guided play above just normal play allows you to help facilitate that development. And they also found it was really effective both in and outside of classroom learning. So be it a teacher, be it a parent, be it a therapist. They did give one kind of quite big caveat, I guess, in this review, which was they did find that guided play had no difference or no extra benefit compared to direct instruction for things like literacy or socio-emotional outcomes. So it's by no means saying this is best for everything, but I would say in some situations, such as, you know, enjoyment, motivation, improving expressive language, guided play might be beneficial. If I'm honest, this was the one study out of the 10 that we included that I suppose, apart from Jade, your first one, which looked at that interleaving, which I thought was going to be higher, because I was expecting when I read the research that assuming if we equate really young children for novices, which I know isn't a complete overlap, but in a ballpark, that there's a lot of research that says direct instruction is really beneficial. I mean, arguably most of benefit for novices. So I was interested to find that they said for some areas, guidance during play, which I always thought was kind of, I was worried it would be a compromise, like the worst of both. They were suggesting in some situations might actually be the best of both. I don't know what you thought when you kind of came across.
Yeah, I thought exactly the same in terms of equating guided play more on the discovery learning side of things. I actually think when you look into it, guided play, I think it would be really difficult because obviously you're letting the pupils to guide where you go. So your subject knowledge has to be huge, and how you respond has to be really well thought out. I think that will be quite difficult for a new teacher. And I think it's something that experienced teachers could maybe do really easily and really well. I also think that there might be a link to manipulatives because it's linked to maths and maths and shape knowledge. I can imagine how using manipulatives in your guided play would be really beneficial, but then part of that will be because it's using manipulatives, not necessarily because it's guided play. So I think there's definitely something to look into there. So yeah, a really nice one. In that for our youngest pupils, we know that there's an additional kind of area of research to look into.
And I think it's really easy when we talk about teaching and learning and indeed cognitive science, that it's easy to focus more on older students. A lot of the studies are done at university students or in secondary school. And so I think expanding our range for the younger students of body of research that we know about, I think can only be a good thing.
Yeah, I agree.
Cool. Study number 9.
So study number 9 looked at mindsets and looked at growth mindset and stress mindset and whether or not we can help to protect adolescents from stress, if we try to develop a different mindset. So first of all, one of the interventions looked at developing a growth mindset in pupils. Basically, I'm sure we'll all know about growth mindset, but anything that's helped students to believe they could get better and improve. So that might be from praising effort and not ability, from welcoming mistakes, from showing pupils that it's normal to struggle, that we want them to struggle with difficult and challenging work, and that's fine. And then the second intervention was called the stress mindset intervention. And this was any intervention which gave the message that we're aware of what stress is. This is what stress might feel like. It might have physical response, you might have a mental response, but why stress can be helpful. So in that we can use use it in physical performances, or we can try to manage it in these different ways. So stress can be good and stress can be useful. And the findings basically showed that if we use both of these interventions together, so if we try to develop a growth mindset in our pupils, and we also try to develop this mindset that stress can be a positive thing, that we basically will benefit our pupils. It will lead to an improvement in stress-related cognitions. It will improve course pass rates, reduce anxiety symptoms, and improve psychological well-being. So I think we've kind of given up on growth mindset a little bit, and we know that there's been research, lots of contrasting research about how effective it is. So this was a really interesting one for me because it maybe says, right, go back and let's re-examine what we know. And is it that actually we need to combine it with this stress mindset to have the most benefit on pupils? I don't know what you thought about that one, Brad. You know much more about growth mindset than I do.
Yeah, I've kind of been engrossed in the growth mindset research for like the last 10 years. And one thing that I'm getting more encouraged about is the lead researcher on this study is a guy called David Jade. And he's done a number of studies in recent years. And the quality of growth mindset studies is significantly increasing. So by that, I mean, it's pre-registered. So basically means you can't cherry pick your results afterwards. A lot of his studies are what they call double blind. So the students don't know what condition they're in, and even the person giving the intervention don't know what condition they're in. And so a lot of his studies are generally regarded as the gold standard of what, you know, psych research could be. And what we're seeing from a lot of his studies is a positive result in terms of some of the growth mindset stuff, but it is a lot smaller than some of the previous studies. And so I think what we're seeing emerging is there is something there. And I think one of the problems with a lot of the growth mindset studies is they often do really short interventions, like it's a one-off half-an-hour intervention. And I've always seen it more personally as it's a philosophy, it's a culture. How do we develop this environment where people believe they can get better, as opposed to it being a 30-minute assembly, a worksheet, you know, a poster. And so I think I like his studies particularly on growth mindset. And what I do quite like about this is it doesn't just look at growth mindset. I like it when studies don't look at things in isolation. So including stress mindset, I think is important, because I do worry that we're getting to the stage where there's a drive to make everyone never experience any negative emotion, never want anyone to be worried about their exams, for example. Whereas actually it's a really healthy human emotion. And the stress mindset stuff of seeing that some stress can be good, it can make me work a bit harder, it can focus more. And obviously excessive stress is bad, but not stress equals bad. That's kind of an oversimplification.
Yeah.
I like it that this kind of study kind of looks at both and found the combination of both. I can improve and some stress will happen, but that's okay. It's, I think, a nice way from a pastoral side of things, or a well-being side of things, as a way forward potentially.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think my main takeaway as well from what you've just said there, it's like doing an assembly on effective study techniques to actually using those effective study techniques in your lessons and talking to students about them all the time. And we know that actually talking to your students about in your subject or in your class about retrieval, spacing, why they're effective, how our memories work, will have a much bigger difference and make it much more likely that they'll use those strategies on their own than if you just do a one-off assembly. And I think that's kind of a really nice message.
And even linking some of the stuff you just said to growth mindset. So it sounds obvious now in hindsight. I'm kind of kicking myself that I didn't think it 10 years ago. But of course, if you have a growth mindset, if you believe you can improve, but you don't know how to, then that mindset will quickly, you know, it will reduce and it will fluctuate and quickly you become demotivated. Whereas what I'd love to see a study in the next few years look at a growth mindset, the belief I can get better, stress mindset that some stress will happen, and teaching students about how to get better, i.e. by doing retrieval and effective studying. That I think would be a really nice Venn diagram for future study. Growth mindset, probably not enough by itself, probably not as big as we had previously thought, but maybe some stuff that's still in there that we can use. So last but not least, the effect of teacher praise to reprimand ratio. Now this did look at young students. I would imagine it might be similar, different, but similar for older students. And why we chose this study as our last one is researchers and educators have for a long time, I think, been interested in, is there a magic number? Is there a magic ratio of praise to reprimand? And you always hear that, you know, people remember the negatives way more than they remember the positives. And yet the research hasn't really been able to come up with a number, essentially, of, you know, how much of your time should be spent praising the positive versus highlighting, criticizing, reprimanding the negatives. So what this study did, it had two groups. It had a control group, which was sort of business as normal. On the next slide, that's going to be the light line that you see on the graph. And then they had an experimental group, which is going to be the darker line, the bolder line on the next graph, which looked at trying to use a technique that encouraged teachers to focus more on praise, essentially. And then they tracked how much time do students spend what they call on task, essentially doing the work you want them to be doing and not disrupting or being distracted elsewhere. So this was the table that they find. When I first saw this, I didn't quite know where to look, so I'll kind of talk people through it. So as I say, the light line is business as normal, and the dark line, which tries to encourage kind of higher praise to reprimand ratio intervention. What they found is there's a positive relationship. So I guess that's the first finding, is there's a positive relationship between you know, higher praise to reprimand ratio, the more time students spend on task. We clearly see on both the intervention and the control group, the line going up towards the top right-hand side. So we know there's a positive relationship between praise to reprimand ratio and on-task behavior. What we also found, I guess, in this study is there is no perfect number. Anyone who ever says, it's 3-to-1 praise to reprimand or 4-to-1, I think those are the two numbers that you often hear about. There's no evidence really to suggest that. There isn't. If that was the case, the graph would kind of look a bit like an inverted U. There'd be a peak in somewhere in the middle, probably. That's not the case. So this suggests, a high praise to reprimand ratio is probably a good thing. Though I would point out what it's not saying is that we don't do any of the reprimanding. I think that's a really important point to make in terms of, yes, we want the ratio high, but if there is behavior that is inappropriate, that does need to be reprimanded, it's absolutely not saying just ignore that behavior and just praise anything that they do is good. It's more about finding a balance and, where possible, having high praise to reprimand ratio. The other thing I think I'd probably just highlight, my reflection on the study is, I think it's really important not to artificially boost that ratio. I think students are very good at detecting inauthentic praise. And I think inauthentic or excessive praise can sometimes come across as patronizing and white noise, and it doesn't really land. So I think for me, it's about identifying where are the opportunities to give authentic praise and highlighting those when we can.
I also think here, Brad, the study probably called praise what I would call acknowledgements. So we all know that we don't want to devalue our praise by praising everything. Oh my God, amazing, you've all come in and sat down. Well, we expect you to come in and sit down, so we don't want to praise that. But they also included, I think, acknowledgements like, right, everybody, this person started working, amazing, great. Now we've got 10 people starting working. What Doug Lemov would have called narrate the positive, where you're narrating the positive things that are happening in your room. You're not necessarily praising everybody. You're not saying that's amazing, that's excellent, well done, but you're saying, you're kind of narrating that positive behavior. So for me, this kind of did fit in with what I think we do already know. It's probably the use of the word praise, which is more misleading in that it's not necessarily, yes, it will be praise, but it will also be narrating that positive behavior. And then also I think using all those techniques that we know, like be seen looking, etc., which will limit the off-task or unwanted behaviour so that you don't have to reprimand as much. There's loads you can do before you reprimand. So I think that's really in line with what we think, but you might not initially think that, if that makes sense.
Perfect. So that is our whistle-stop tour in just over an hour of the 10 studies. Jade, before we kind of go on to the next part, I just wanted to really put you under the spotlight. Your final reflections, because obviously we had loads of different studies to choose from, and we do have to arbitrarily choose 10, it has to be a cutoff. Any studies that really stood out for you, or that really, I guess, confirmed what you're already doing and it's just a good self-esteem boost, or anything that changed how you had previously saw stuff? And any kind of thoughts and reflections?
Yeah, so I really like the one about spacing and interleaving, because I think that really clarifies why spacing is effective and why interleaving is effective and how they can be used most effectively. And that's kind of where I'm at with my research-informed practice. Yes, we know these things are effective, but how can they be most effective? So I think that's really important. And then secondly, I really like the seductive details one and the retrieval, because it's adding a little bit more nuance, a little bit more depth to what we already know. So I really like that as well.
Lovely.
How about you?
Yeah, I mean, I actually really like the first study, even though it didn't show anything new as such. Like, it was a review of the previous study. My heart sinks every time a psych study doesn't replicate, because it's just like, oh, we put our faith in research, and then more research comes along and says, this stuff doesn't apply anymore, or we don't think it does. So I actually think replications are really important. They're not as glamorous, but it just adds more weight to our confidence in terms of what we do know. So yeah, I'd probably go for that one. Everyone else, if you can, please do share with us. I'll put our Twitter links up at the end. Please do share with us what your favourite study or take home was. It's always really interesting to see what people take from it. In terms of what comes next, today, Jade and I, this is exclusive news. We're very excited to announce that this was kind of our pilot run. Basically, when Jade came up with this brilliant idea, we thought it was brilliant, but we didn't know if anyone would actually turn up or would think it was brilliant as well. We've been amazed by the reaction. We've had people from over 60 countries sign up, so it's just been amazing. We are doing 4 of these in January. We will put the link in the chat box now for our Eventbrite. We are operating on a first come, first served basis. So tonight we've had to put on an overflow to capture all the people who wanted. I don't think we're going to do that moving forward. So the link should be in the chat box now. If you want to come to all 4 sessions, we're doing every 3 months. There is a discount, or you could book just for the January one if you wanted to. I saw the link did go in the chat box. I'm just going to ask my colleague to put it in again, just because I know there's lots of comments coming through and I don't want it to kind of get lost along the way. As if by magic, there it is. So yes, we are quite keen for this stuff to get out there. So anyone who does book, we will send a recording out afterwards, and anyone in your school can access the recording. We will send out, the magazine is an electronic magazine, so you can have access to that for everyone in your school. There's only space for 1 person who signs up per webinar, but we're very keen for, if knowledge is power and there's gold in the research, we're quite keen for it to get out there. So please do sign up, or else it'll just be me and Jade talking to each other about our favourite studies, which I'm all right with, but Jade bored. So yes, that's our plug for launching today, and we'll put it on Twitter later, but if you want to get ahead of the queue, there's the link. If you loved the session, please do give us praise on Twitter. If you hated the talk, send us private emails to complain is usually a better plan for that. Thank you for giving up your time. We're happy to stick around and answer any questions. Hopefully we did the research justice. And yeah, that's it from me. Anything from you, Jade?
No, just thank you so much for attending, everybody. And like Brad says, we're hoping it's a really easy way for teaching and learning leads and teachers to kind of stay up to date without having to do too many hours yourself. So if you're interested, then sign up.
Cheers. Thank you very much, everyone. It's been a pleasure.